Hello, everyone. My name is Soledad Gutierrez. I'm the Chief Curator of TBA 21 and responsible for the content on TBA 21 on stage. Today, we are here as a part of the Backstage series, speaking with Sophie, Julia, and Timur. They are going to present us a project titled Dissolving Earth, curated by Undead Matter, which Sophie is responsible for. And this project started as a research on one of the most farthest and sometimes unknown lands, that is Siberia, and focusing on the permafrost, one of those beings that are in really danger and that will have an impact, a tremendous impact in our ecosystems, a being that we have to really take care of. This project has been very much influenced by the political context, and this reminds us how we speak about ecology and how the entanglement of the many factors that lie together sometimes arise and make themselves as visible and as present as possible. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to let Sophie, Timur, and Julia introduce themselves, and then we will continue with the conversation. Thank you very much for joining us in this virtual space.
Thank you so much, Soledad. So I'm Sophie J. Williamson. I'm a curator based between London and Margate. My curatorial practice is called Undead Matter, and this is a cross-disciplinary curatorial practice that brings together different voices to consider our place within the ever-turning matter of the universe and where the edges of life lies. And so this curatorial research and curatorial practice led me many years ago to a fascination and a curiosity in the permafrost, which we can talk about in more detail later, but that brought me to Siberia, and out of that evolved a lot of research and connections with people across Yakutia in particular, and led me to work with Yulia and Timur at a Russian institution that allowed us a collaboration where we could commission this project.
My name is Yulia Gromova. I'm currently a scientific associate at the Department of Art and Economics here at Documenta Institute and Kassel University in Germany. And in my research, I focus on the issues of carbon governance. I look at the set of problems that modernity encounters at our time of ecological predicament, and I'm very interested to critically engage with the narratives, economic narratives and social narratives that could be adequate to the scale of complexity to the scale of planetary complexities.
Hi, I'm Timur Zlatoyev. I'm a Berlin-based editor, researcher, and curator working between architecture, design, and contemporary art. Originally, I'm from Siberia, from the Republic of Buryatia, so it's been particularly exciting for me to be involved in this kind of project and bring my connections in this field and my connections to this land.
Thank you, everyone. And maybe the first question is to Sophie. How did you start in being, as mentioned before, obsessed with the permafrost? And how did you get in connection or get to start in Siberia? No, I mean, that's the root of the project, how it started. What was its beginning?
Yeah. So the Permafrost Festival, maybe I should explain what the permafrost is, because I think it's a word which people know but don't necessarily understand what those landscapes are. So the permafrost is frozen soil, some of which is hundreds of thousands of years old, but some of which there's an active layer that thaws and refreezes every year. And so stemming from this interest in, where we're positioned in the universe in terms of time and matter and materiality forming and reforming, I found that permafrost is a very poetic space that held these different temporalities. It holds the deep past, but as it thaws, it is releasing huge amounts of carbon and methane, but also viruses, and it suspends organic life. And so when that starts thawing, all this organic life is starting to rot and meld with the contemporary. So it also then has this relationship to the deep future. It's a tipping point for our planet's ecology. And so for me, the permafrost was really this poetic space which was a glitch in linear time. And my first interest, I guess, was when I was in Canada, and I met this wonderful artist, Peter von Tiesenhausen, who is now a wonderful friend. And he really satiated my curiosity for it. He would tell me these magical stories about when he was a young man. Now he's in his 60s, but when he was a young man, he started out life as an extraction miner. So his job was to drill through the permafrost. And he would tell these magical stories about discovering entire forest floors that were just there, suspended, that you could find kind of bones that looked as if the animals had died yesterday, or even roots and leaves and all this organic material that was just as if the forest had just been frozen in that moment of time. And so in the winter of 2020, I got some support to go out to Yakutia. I, in particular, wanted to go to this place called Pleistocene Park, which is a rewilding project where they're trying to recreate the mammoth steppe of 20,000 years ago as a means to try to prevent or try to slow the permafrost melting. Unfortunately, it's too difficult to get there in the winter, so I spent my time in November and December in Yakutsk, which is the coldest city in the world. It was really freezing. It was like -40 when I was there, and it gets colder. And there I spent time with geologists and cryomicrobiologists and permafrost hydrologists at the Permafrost Institute, which is just this wealth of knowledge. And there I really started to bring together these ideas of like what it really means, this landscape which holds the deep past in this non-linear fashion. Because I was able to stroke the fur on a 42,000-year-old mammoth. Could smell its decomposing body, its cells were going into mine. And so I think when we think about planetary futures, we're often thinking about what the planet might look like for our children or our grandchildren. But it's quite hard to think about temporalities that are beyond this lifespan. But there, standing, stroking this fur on this mammoth, you feel much of a much longer temporality. You're part of you can feel, you can touch, you can smell the deep past. And so for me, it's this space which really opens up a space to be able to think more empathetically about our responsibilities to planetary futures by means of having this dialogue with the deep past.
How was the project formed? Because it starts with this research, with this being on site. And then there are other voices like the one of Timur, the one of Julia, that suddenly also get involved, I would say, throughout that interdisciplinary research, with the idea of converging knowledges and how they can trigger a deeper understanding.
Yeah, so I was really lucky that I'd been talking about this research to many people, and the British Council knew about the work. So they reached out. They had a grant, which we can talk about the kind of position relationship with the British Council later, but the British Council offered this possibility of applying for a grant, which was the context was a a cross-cultural collaboration, so between a British institute and a Russian organization. And so I reached out to the institution that Yulia and Timur were working at the time, and it became this beautiful collaboration between us, where we could share our research and share our interests, and then were able to bring in lots of other voices. So it was primarily a commissioning project, but we had quite a long period, which Julia can probably speak about in more detail, which was really about us nurturing new research as well. So reaching out to people from all different scientific fields and bringing in these artists to exchange knowledge from artists from across Siberia, but also artists from the UK.
For me, this is specifically interesting to see how can we build these bridges between various independent curators, artists, organizations, scientists as well, beyond institutional practices. This is something I'm interested at, because it doesn't mean that institution is not there, the institutional scaffolding is needed, but for me it's interesting how to see how can we activate other connections and networks between beyond the institutional framework. And I think in this project we kind of provided this sort of framework. One might call it institutional practice. And I use this term institution, which is quite a new term, and it's been introduced by Primavera di Filippi and a group of other researchers. And this term, I guess, describes pretty accurately our practice with the Dissolving Earth program. Its institutional theory provides an alternative lens to look at social groups and social organizations and to see why and how people work with each other, where traditionally the institutional practice would be about the roles and the rules that organizations assign to people, where in the institutional practices, people act more on the basis of their identities and their values.
And that's really interesting because, I mean, sorry to interrupt, in the sense of being institutional, no? Taking the term from you as well, but at the same time, very much plays on a location, no? Because permafrost doesn't happen all over the world. It's a very unique landscape. And at the same time, the knowledge, I mean, there is a scientific knowledge associated to it, but there is also a First People, Indigenous knowledge, no? Of local inhabitants, local people that have been inhabiting that land. And maybe that's also Timur's relationship with the place, no? That is relevant, like how you understand permafrost also as a mean of living, no? How you, because sometimes when we look from it, I mean, we look into it, it's an imaginary landscape, it's mythological, no? But that mythology has a daily living. And that's really important to understand the whole process and precisely to being able to create that kind of knowledge you were mentioning, Julia.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when we approached this project, it was really important for us to have this epistemological diversity to make sure that different types of knowledges are represented in this endeavor of envisioning this imaginaries of permafrost. So we had scientists, but scientists who are indigenous Siberians, but also scientists who are originally from the European part of Russia. We had artists who are indigenous of Siberia, but in conversation with artists from the UK who have never been to these lands, but they together are imagining and talking about this critically important landscape. So it was so interesting to represent like scientific knowledge, indigenous knowledge, We had a shaman talking with us, but interesting that shaman, she is both like indigenous practitioner, but she's also an ethnologist. So herself combining like ancestral knowledge with modern science. So it was this incredible entanglement of opinions, knowledges, and perspectives that I think was really crucial part of this project.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it was really interesting coming into those conversations from a Western perspective, where scientific knowledge certainly follows kind of a Judeo-Christian trajectory of like this moment of creation and this kind of linear progression, and being with scientists, at the cutting edge of their fields, but coming from a position, the scientists who I was with at the Permafrost Institute were actually not all from the same Indigenous backgrounds. They had different cosmologies that they had been brought up with, but that many of those cosmologies revolved around more cyclical time understanding, and that really influences the way of talking about their scientific knowledge and therefore shaping it. So that was what was so interesting, I think, about bringing these very different, disparate people together from very different contexts, is where those things rubbed up against one another, and made us each kind of rethink, for me especially, rethink assumptions that I'd made. For example, this word adaptation came up a lot, because the scientists, paleontologists or geologists or cryomicrobiologists had grown up seeing animals coming out of the permafrost in the summer thaws that hadn't been able to adapt. And so this idea of like how human society needs to adapt was very much part of these cosmological lineages that they'd been brought up with. The other thing which maybe is also worth mentioning is that we had originally wanted to do an in situ part of the program, and it wasn't possible in the end. And we were doing this still within the confines of COVID travel restrictions. And something that is important to say about the permafrost is that it's a vast landscape. It's almost a quarter of the entire northern hemisphere's landmass. So a lot of it has never been touched by any humans. And the people that we were collaborating with from across the Yakutian and Buryat regions were also only knowing very specific locations. And so a lot of the project was really about, how you can imagine this landscape and engage emotionally and with respect and responsibility with a landscape from afar, because it's a landscape which we are all implicated in. The clothes that I wear, the way that I heat my home, the food that I eat is part of global climate change, and therefore we're intrinsically imprinted on this landscape, which most of us will never visit.
And how long did this, let's say, research phase or commissioning phase, no? Because I understand that this commissioning practice or commissioning process was in parallel to this research, like establishing conversations with the different disciplines, with different ways of approaching the permafrost. How long did it take, and what was the next steps? No, how was the process?
My personal research started the first time I visited Yakutia was in 2020, and then this collaboration between the three of us came up about a year later, and we had quite a long period of research between the three of us to start, maybe several months, and then several months of arranging these online kind of workshops and seminars between these really brilliantly specific scientists that opened up this whole world of new investigations and lines of inquiries for the artists and the writers that we were working with.
When Sophie approached us, we started to see who specifically we can contact, and we contacted various institutions in Russia that would normally not talk to each other, I would say. We talked to people from the Permafrost Institute in Yakutsk. We talked to head research at Baikal, a neutrino telescope. We talked to someone from a hydrologist from Northeast University in Yakutsk, and we basically organized online meetings, and then we invited artists and as shamanist Timur has already mentioned. So we organized kind of workshops where the scientists would tell about the field of their research, and some of the artists would engage more close afterwards. For me, maybe one of the most fascinating engagements was with the specialists from Baikal Neutrino Telescope and this underwater observatory, which is located underneath the Lake Baikal and is designed to study high energy cosmic rays. And it is built to capture neutrinos, these subatomic particles that are very, very hard to capture. But then when they interact with matter, they produce sort of faint light, and the clear water of Lake Baikal allows to capture these neutrinos that comes from the far regions of our universe. So it was a super fascinating conversation with him. And one of the invited researchers, Lucas Likapchan, had talked to Dmitry and had produced this beautiful essay, which is more on a philosophical side, philosophical reflection of how this, getting back to your comment, Soledad, that is very specifically a project that is focused specifically on this landscape. So Lucas in his essay talks about how this specific geographical location, the Lake Baikal, allows us kind of sort of becomes a device to study, to get this knowledge about our universe.
And then the lake as well, with him in particular, it was really fascinating. Not just the fact that it's really a place of cutting edge discovery, like on the frontier of understanding the cosmos, but it's also a space where they really have to respect Indigenous traditions as well. So that's kind of all part of their working processes at the site.
It's really fascinating, not to follow throughout time also, and to be able to understand how deep the conversations went on, how this inform and how this create the project. And then I assume that after these months of conversations, digital workshop, fighting against travel restrictions, there was a moment where this was meant to be public and that was going to be presented, if I'm not wrong, on a digital platform. Wasn't it the case?
Yeah, so the project was due to launch in March 2022, only shortly before Russia invaded Ukraine. And so we halted the program for obvious reasons. And we paused to reflect and think about how we would need to reposition it. And we needed to think through how this would have consequences for the people that we were working with. But then the decision to launch was also taken out of our hands for two reasons, but predominantly because the project was funded by the British Council, and the UK Foreign Office sanctioned the project. It sanctioned any cultural collaborations between the UK and Russia. This was this was very problematic on many different reasons, on many different levels. But the British Council were the ones to kind of they withdrew funding for all of their programs, which were in collaboration with Russia. What actually came to light many months later, after me kind of spending a long time fighting to get everybody paid who had done work already. You know, everybody had produced the project, the program, everybody had made their commissions. And so it was really quite a long and difficult battle to get money released to be able to pay these people. And then the next obstacle was to be able to get the project released. And it turned out many months later that actually the sanctions were specifically to do with, which makes sense, the British Council funding projects with Russian state institutions. And the institution that we were working with was not a state institution. It was an independent institution, and one which played a very important part in the kind of Russian cultural independent cultural discourse. So actually, maybe Timur, you might want to speak about the institution and its position, and the kind of the consequences of the war, the invasion.
Yes, indeed, it was incredibly difficult time for everyone, and I left the country soon after the start of the war, and soon our institution announced that it will cease its operations in response to this events. And the project basically went into the table for many months. And the fact that we decided to bring it back, I think, speaks to it's in a way to recognize the continued ecological and colonial oppressions that is happening in Russia, as our project is it seeks to give platform to indigenous voices, to communities and ecologists from Siberia. So we thought that it is right time to still go ahead and publish this project.
I think also to add to that is that, that for me as a British curator, and coming to work with this community of people that we'd really created around the program, the funding being stopped and all of the participants, artists and scientists, being silenced effectively by the British Council was something which I felt very strongly about. Is that the global ecological crisis is directly a consequence of historic colonial violence, of continued colonial violence and continued capitalist extraction. That is, the richest colonizing countries in the world, of which I am a citizen of one, are the cause for so many communities, human and non-human, living in extremely precarious ecologies now. And for the project to be sanctioned by the kind of colonial institution of the British Council was quite painful, I think, for many of the participants, myself included, when it was deliberately using this British Council money to give voice to people and communities and ecologies which don't often get a platform to speak. And so it was this kind of double violence, I think, in this consequence of being sanctioned.
And this brings us, this is the moment where you, Sophia, approach us, TBA 21 on a stage, at TBA 21 as a foundation. And this is the moment we also felt that it was really important to support the project, not because, precisely because of that, because we try to fight against a system, or we try to make visible that sometimes it's the actual system. No, it's not one side or the other, it's the whole entanglement of different responsibilities that has an impact on the ecologies we inhabit and the ecologies that we need to preserve in order to be able, as a humans, to survive. We have to learn new ways, new paths, and only through collaboration and through further understanding and really wide dialogues, we will be able to understand better what we are speaking about. No? And in this case, the permafrost seemed like a very good example of what you were trying to put forward. No? With these projects, it seemed a very good example of the practices that we felt they were relevant, and how we have to back these kind of dialogues and making them possible. So that's also the reason why we are holding the conversation today, to understand that sometimes decisions that seem like kind of are taken in a general context affect, like, for example, we were discussing, Sophie, the impossibility of scientists to come to Europe, not to present research or to open or to continue those conversations. It's not only, or on top of not being able to listen to certain voices, it's also the incapacity of being presenting like something that it's called science, that it's normally understood and respected within the system. So that's also something that happened, no, throughout the whole last year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as Yulia was alluding to earlier, my understanding in Russia is that there's not so much of this kind of cross-institutional collaboration. And certainly when I was there before war, there was this reluctancy for scientists to share their research with one another. But there's been, really detrimental impacts on and I can only talk about this anecdotally from the collaborators that I am still in touch with. Many of the collaborators that were involved, or the participants that were involved in the program, we just haven't been able to get in contact with since the war started. And others, the ones who I am in contact with, have really, it's had a huge impact on their on really vital work. So without saying any names, one example was an Indigenous rights activist who left Russia immediately with his children and his grandchildren, and who I haven't been able to be in contact with since. A permafrost hydrologist who I continue to collaborate with and work with on many things, but his work was collecting really vital data, and that work was all funded in collaboration with researchers from other countries, all of whom have withdrawn their staff and their financial support since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So his work isn't able to continue in the way it was before. He, for some time, was having a lot of difficulty getting visas to be able to come to present research at international conferences, for example. But with the permafrost in particular, I think it's worth noting that the majority of scientific knowledge of permafrost is based in two very small locations, one in North America and one in Sweden. But most of the permafrost is across Russia's Siberia. And so those collaborations, international collaborations with particular scientific institutions, were already very few and far between already before the war. And since the war, those ties have really been severed, at least from my understanding from the people that I've been working with. And of course, that's true with the artists as well. Both Yulia and Timur have left Russia, but the majority of the artists that we were working with have also left Russia, because it's not feasible for them to continue to make their work and practice, which is inevitably touches on the political. To speak about climate change and to speak about ecology is inevitably always politicized.
That happens, and this is an important point to make. Like, sometimes defending ecology and being an environmental fighter is one of the most challenging positions one can ever take. I mean, we have been working throughout different far-flung geographies. We've been very involved in some organizations in Chile, and we have been being together with different people throughout the world that have been fighting for environmental rights and have been suffering a lot the pressure of different countries. So it's kind of one of the most poignant activity at the moment, because it presents and it shows up, like I would say, the most urgent issues and have a lot of political impact. Not only political, but because it's very much connected with extractivism, and that's part of the system. So in that sense, it's something that we have been experiencing throughout the globe. And I wanted to ask you now, where's the project now? I mean, it's going to be presented throughout different institutions in different moments, in different sections. So how is it coming together? How are you continue working together with, I mean, the also constellation of people, no, and beings that have came on board, and there are still, we are having this conversation, and the three of you are still
I
working
think
together.
so we've continued to work together. Obviously, it's different now as all three of us are working on it independently. But the project has morphed, and as Timur says, the project became more urgent than ever, I think. It's exactly because of these cross-cultural and cross-scientific dialogues being severed that working in this way is so important. The permafrost is an urgent landscape to discuss, and now there's this kind of severance between collaboration with people from the region. It's more urgent than ever to talk about it, and to think about how nation states politics really impact on global ecological futures. So the project, the program, has found a new life, and it will be launched on the 8th of April at Het Nieuw Institute in Rotterdam, and is being supported by TBA 21, Het Nieuw Institute, Mimosa House, and Documenta Institute, to be able to reach many different audiences to those that the original program would have spoken to. And the artists have continued to develop their work in that time as well. I think that one big change is that many of the artists have, particularly the artists from Siberia, have repositioned their work and taken time to reflect on what it means to be making work like this in the new political context, and what it means to have a voice and a platform to do so. But also crucially, many of those artists are now working under pseudonyms, and I think that that's quite a powerful part of the project, actually, is to realize the importance of speaking about these things, but the fragility of doing so, also the precarity of doing so.
It's really important for us to give platform to these voices because, especially in the context of the war, many indigenous minorities have been under particular pressure, facing higher mobilization rates and death tolls, and represented, often misrepresented in this war as like main troopers of the invasion, while what's often is not heard enough is that it is often the minorities who are leading the anti-war resistance in Russia and beyond. And it's really kind of the war has allowed many voices to be heard in that sense because of all that tension and all the pressure. So I hope the world now will have more, will listen and pay more attention to the perspectives and plight of indigenous peoples of Russia, of Siberia in particular.
I also just want to add that we are certainly in the UK and across the world, there was this huge outpouring of support to Ukrainians that were having to flee their country, and it was very immediate suffering. And I think that's something which we as humans really respond to. We're empathetic beings, but I think that there's this huge widespread suffering which we don't feel is palpable. We don't see the suffering that's in these really precarious locations. And so climate change will impact the most vulnerable societies in the world, the most vulnerable communities in the world. And there's communities living across Siberia, as an example, as one of many examples across the planet, whose entire ecologies and therefore livelihoods are being completely decimated through no fault of their own, but through the impact of the way that we live hundreds of thousands of miles away. And so there's I think maybe that is sits maybe right at the core of the need to launch this project, is that that we keep dialogues alive that are about precarious ecologies wherever they are, dialogues that can transcend nation states, political discourse, and how important it is to speak amongst individuals and communities and ecologies. There's these kind of like two parallel worlds working all the time, the one of kind of political violence and the one of this kind of longer term. Sometimes we see it as slower or out of sight, but it's equally violent, I think, which is decimating ecologies everywhere.
Thank you very much. I think that's really important. No? I mean, we have to overcome our particular needs. Particular could be state needs, company needs, to create a dialogue that it's going through if we want to really face the needs and the urgency of climate change. So thank you very much to you all. And thank you for the commitment towards projects and towards the project, and also towards the communities that inhabit the different lands. So thank you very much.